Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Fullest podcast. I'm your host, Nikki Bostwick, and today's guest is Jennifer Margulis, who's a PhD science writer and author of my absolute favorite and number one book ever, Your Baby, Your Way. And she's the co-author with Dr. Paul Thomas of the number one Amazon bestseller, The Vaccine Friendly Plan. Jennifer is a meticulous researcher who's not afraid to be controversial. She's nationally known as a science journalist who opens people's eyes to the realities behind accepted practices in healthcare and medicine. And she's passionate about investigating the overlooked dangers of mainstream practices, especially when scientific evidence has been brushed aside in favor of special interests. Uncovering these issues is a matter of social justice, and through her writing, she champions the rights of society's most vulnerable, which includes children, mothers, the working poor, older adults, and others on the social or economic margins. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi, Nikki.
Thank you so much for joining us. I have to say, I have been a huge fan of yours forever. When I was pregnant with my son, I found your book, and it was the single best thing that ever happened to me because I felt like I was totally meant to find. I'm almost positive I found it like at Barnes & Noble, but I don't know. It was like so random. I just went in the baby section and probably just like grabbed a book when normally I like research before I buy books. But it changed my life. It changed everything that I thought. I didn't know anything about pregnancy. I was like a total clean slate, and it empowered me. It educated me. It honestly gave me the confidence that I needed to become a mom and to advocate for my child from day one. And I just can never thank you enough for what you did for writing that book, because it truly, even in the first few days, I've told you this, I've talked about this on the podcast, but like the first few days of having my son and what I had to go through in terms of advocating for him at the hospital and what they wanted to do and all sorts of things, I would have never had the courage without your research. So I love you. I love your book, Your Baby, Your Way. And I recommend it to every single mom, whether they're a new mom or not. And I'm so happy to have you on the podcast.
I'm so glad to hear that the book resonated with you so much, and I'm glad to be here.
I really also just want to commend you because I think a lot of times with the type of work and speaking out about these sorts of things, it's always connected with, like, oh no, we need to vaccinate because we need to make sure we're protecting each other. And, it's a privileged thing to not do these things. And I think and there aren't a lot of people that can really like turn it around and say, actually, it's so wrong what we're doing to these people, to minorities. And like, we have to speak up in order to protect them, because that is the most vulnerable group. And that is the group that needs this information the most. Everyone needs it, but it's like, I think it's just so interesting the way people view it and the way society and so media and everyone has skewed things. And I think that's also another reason why your work is so important. And I think it's beautiful that you can research things for, and really get to the bottom of it. Because I think I consider myself someone, especially after my son's diagnosis, like really researching through things, but it's so confusing and it requires a special type of person. So I would love to kind of learn about, I know you started as like an investigative journalist, not necessarily with birth or anything, and what you specialized in, and then how you kind of got into this space.
Yeah, I actually started writing for a living after being in academia. So I have a PhD in the humanities. I studied 19th century American and African American literature. And I was a graduate student when I met my husband, and we had our first baby in Atlanta, Georgia. I was at Emory University, and it was the way into researching issues around pregnancy and childbirth happened because I was having such a hard time with pregnancy, and then after that with childbirth. And Nikki, like, I had wanted to have children my whole life. I never thought that I wouldn't be a mom. It was just something I absolutely wanted to do. And I was so excited to get pregnant. And I was so in love with my husband. And I was zooming on the bike path in Atlanta with, when I was 8.5 months pregnant, and just feeling really good and really healthy. And every time I went to the doctor, I felt I would leave the doctor's office. I would get in the car in the parking lot and just cry. And my husband came with me to every appointment. And it was really hard. So I thought I was, like going into a nurturing situation. Pregnancy, as you know, because you're expecting another baby, is a state of tremendous good health and potential and opportunity. And it's like your hopes and dreams are being manifest, and you're like sharing space with this tiny little creature that you've carried with you your entire life, but you've never met before. It's like such a magical time. And I wanted to be enjoying it. And instead, I felt like I was just getting beaten down. And I mean, that was pregnancy. And then when I had the baby, like I am a strong woman. I have big hips. And I only gained, around 20 pounds during my whole pregnancy because I'd been a little bit heavy when I started. And so the weight all shifted, and I was really careful about what I was eating. I was exercising all the time. And then I had just a really nightmarish experience in Crawford Long Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia, which no longer exists, where I was literally physically, mentally, and emotionally abused during 22 hours of labor.
Wow.
So after that, I went back to work. I had to start working again when the baby was 6 weeks old, which was one of the hardest things I've ever done. And I was an assistant professor at Emory University. And in the meantime, Nikki, my insurance company denied my claim. And they basically said that my pregnancy was a pre-existing condition, even though I'd had 4 years of good health insurance through Emory, right? And so I got to see all of these bills, and then I'm nursing this tiny little newborn, and I'm on the phone with the insurance company. And one of the things I noticed was that everything I hadn't wanted, because I really had wanted to have, I knew even then, before I had really started jumping into the research, that the most scientific birth is the least technological. And I'm borrowing that phrase from a professor of the history of medicine. She wrote a wonderful, wonderful article in The Atlantic called "The Most Scientific Birth is the Least Technological." So I hadn't wanted any of the interventions that they had really pushed on me and bullied me into getting. And then I saw the bill, and every single intervention that I had said no thank you to was an extra charge for the hospital. It was unbelievable how much money it was for each and everything. And, even if they give you one Tylenol in the hospital, which pregnant women should never take Tylenol, but they give it to you anyway, the markup is 6,000%. And I'm not misspeaking. That's not a misplaced zero. It's, so the profit motive was sort of staring me in the face. And that was kind of the beginning of what ended up being a 10-year investigation into how our decisions during pregnancy, childbirth, and the first year of our children's lives are really skewed and influenced by for-profit medicine, by, big pharma, and not by the interests of what's best for your baby's health.
And then you went on to not only take that into, how it's, like you mentioned, how skewed it is, but then how it affects people, our children, as they become adults. And, your research, you spoke about how, I think this was in your book, or maybe it was on your website and I had just read about it, but the connection between things like epidurals and addiction and those sorts of things. I mean, that's not talked about at all, right?
Yeah, no, it's true. So you mentioned the book that I co-wrote with Dr. Paul Thomas, The Vaccine Friendly Plan. And then we wrote another book that came out in 2018 called The Addiction Spectrum.
Yeah, I haven't read it and I really want to so badly, especially because you're part of it. I'm like, I need it. So, how is that?
And that book, it's very interesting. I mean, from the point of view of a parent, especially if you're a young parent, you really are just trying to get through every day. I mean, you said you have a 2.5-year-old, and I don't know about you, but I found that toddlers kind of brought me to my knees. And in fact, the first book that I did, kind of for a commercial audience when I was transitioning from academia into writing was about toddlers, just because I was like, how do people live with these tiny, irrational, urgent, crazy people? Just so, they're such amazing characters, but boy, are they difficult, when you're in the throes of parenting, it's hard to kind of think about, what's going to happen in 20 years or whatever. But by fast forward to 2018, and Dr. Thomas had an incredibly successful addiction clinic where he was actually helping young people. So he had noticed from issues in his own family, and he's very open about this. He is a recovering alcoholic himself. I mean, he's recovered. He's been sober for more than 15 years. And his wife was a recovering opioid addict who had really struggled with opioid addiction. And their children have had some struggles as well. And so that was part of when they were trying to figure out how to help and cure, heal their own family. They realized that there was this real need for an addiction clinic that could really help younger adults, as opposed to like sort of, that the people in that transition period kind of between pediatrics when you've outgrown that and being in their 40s or whatever, that they didn't have a place to get treatment. And so our book, The Addiction Spectrum, is based on, the research, the results that he got from his clinic and, so many years of his own struggles plus his own research about addiction. And one thing that you said which is really, it's hard to think about, I think, honestly, but what happens around pregnancy and childbirth has an effect on your baby. I mean, you're cohabitating right now with a little human, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I don't know how that pregnancy is going for you, but I know that when I have 4 children, and I know with every pregnancy, I was a different person. I was sharing, space with someone who had their own genetics and their own personalities. And I think that starts really early, and it makes sense now, especially to me, even more as my children get older. My oldest is 21 and my youngest is 11, right? But I see more and more how, pregnancy and childbirth and you're just that how you come into the world really does have an effect on how you feel about yourself and the decisions you make later in your life. And that can be wonderful because, if you've really kind of done things the way that you feel is to optimize your children's health, like that can be a really empowering thing. And it also can be really hard because I had an epidural with my first child. I didn't want it, but I was told that I was being, quote, selfish. And, the doctor who was on call was the only male doctor in this practice. I had never met him before. He comes in and he tells me that I'm being selfish and that I'm making people wait, meaning my mom and my husband, and just really shamed me and said, you have to do this, basically. And no one told me what was in those epidurals. And it turns out that, if you look up the ingredients in an epidural, that one of the ingredients that they're using now, I mean, it depends on the brand and the hospital and the time period, but is fentanyl, which is it's a very effective opioid. It really works. And it's very short acting. And so doctors will say, oh, well, that's complete nonsense. It's short acting. It's not going to stay in the baby's system. But the truth is we don't know. But we are exposing hundreds of thousands, actually millions of newborns or, tiny little babies to a highly addictive opioid. How could that be safe in the absence of data that it actually is? And the truth is, when you start looking into it, you see that babies born via epidural often will have a lot of problems. They'll have more problems with breastfeeding. The baby is exhausted and is literally on drugs. Literally, your baby's born on drugs. It's much harder for a baby to latch. It's much harder for a mom and a baby to bond. And these are things that we know from the scientific literature. What the long-term effects of opioid exposure in utero via these mainstream unquestioned interventions actually has never been studied.
Yeah, I know. I found one study, and I don't know if it was through an article you had or something, but it was talking about how like that the last like 10 hours of your labor are like the imprinting period for your child. And so like we talked about a little before we started the podcast, but it's like it's literally how they're, like you said, coming into this world. And then later on, if they ever try it, because everything is now laced with it, right? These opioids are being laced and given to people, even if they're not intentionally trying to get fentanyl, then maybe they, are at a party and they try something for the first time. They're curious, but then it will totally resonate with them for that reason, because it's something that's so familiar to them and that they experience during such an important period in their life. Like when you just are introduced into this world, and it makes my blood boil, because I really think that the addiction issue is just so tragic and the real pandemic in this country. And it's all on purpose. It's incentivized. The pharmaceutical companies, they've admitted to incentivizing people or the doctors by saying, okay, if you have someone who overdosed on opioids, we'll give you like money, like we'll I don't know what it's called, like a rebate or something, whatever, so that they don't feel like they lost a patient. And it all goes back. And I really do believe that it all goes back to the birth and childbirth, pregnancy, and like those the way that you continue to communicate with your children and toddlers are so difficult. And like being a conscious parent is so difficult still, because everyone has baggage. And as much as you work on it, like healing comes in layers. So you're going to heal an issue, and then maybe years later you come back to it and with a new perspective. So like for me, I'm curious, because I have this question, because my husband's cousin, who is essentially like a sibling to him and over at our house like all the time, who lived this privileged life, really had both his parents they were divorced, but they were involved in his life. He found a girlfriend, he was going to get married, but he was 30 years old, and for the last 15 years of his life he was addicted to opioids. And he said to me during COVID, such shutdowns, like we would have dinner with him every night. He'd come over, I'd make food, and he said, heroin doesn't work on me anymore. I have to use fentanyl, and I use it every single day. And I didn't know what it was. And so I just had this question, because another cousin of his had overdosed on heroin, and two other ones are currently addicted. There's literally like this family lineage. So I really believe in like ancestral healing and energetic healing, and also, like you said, like the soul that's it. Like right now, my child, the way she is in my stomach is so different than the way my son was. And I can totally tell his personality and like right currently and the way he was in my stomach. It's like so similar, so like you said, they're all different, and it starts at so early on. But I'm curious, like how the communication, I've heard like shaming, I really like to follow like RIE parenting and stuff like that. And I'm curious, like the way that obviously I had an epidural, I had certain things, and yes, I try and be as conscious as possible, but it freaks me out. So I'm like, what are certain things that you saw in your research that really were created this issue with addiction?
You mean to help get around it, or to
address it, because I think it's like not address it, to prevent it. Sorry.
Right, prevent it. Right. You said to create it. I don't want to give people a recipe.
No.
Although they're kind of, there actually are recipes for that. I mean, it's true. If you, what I mean is that if you look at, first of all, addiction crosses all socioeconomic, lines and
exactly, yeah.
Lines, and it affects so many people, and from every walk of life, and which is something, there's a stereotype, I think, in the United States that the addict is sort of someone shuffling down the street wearing duct tape on their shoes and going through garbage cans, and that's not true at all. I mean, you see a huge amount of addiction among medical doctors and lawyers and other professionals. So it's important to keep that in mind. But, I think that you're asking kind of a big question about parenting in general. Yeah. Like how do we raise our kids to be sort of psychologically happy, resilient, not happy, because I don't think that humans as a default are going to be happy. And I don't know that you want like a happy-go-lucky life is not necessarily a life of meaning that's well lived. But I think that you're asking, how do you raise children who have good self-esteem and a strong boundaries and know how to say no, thank you when there's peer pressure, and also know how to ask for help. And, when they're feeling lonely, don't turn to drugs, alcohol, or pornography, but turn to human relationships, right? I think that's the question. And it's a question I think that every parent would like to have the answer to. And a couple of things that I can point to that might be helpful in terms of the research is one is the huge importance of early and consistent skin-to-skin contact. So humans thrive in relationships with other humans, and we're mammals, and we need active touching. And, there's fascinating research that's been done with other mammals, rodents, and even on primates, where, they see that there's this tremendous benefit to the mother rat just like licking her babies, and that if you have dogs, they do that too. They teach the babies how to use the potty in the appropriate way by licking them. And you can think, oh, that's disgusting, but no, it's actually beautiful. It's communication with your newborn, right? And so continued, affection in a home, of course, appropriate affection. And, but I think that you can't underestimate the importance of hugs and cuddles and loving adults in a child's life. And, and going along with that, which is something, no parent is perfect. And if someone listening is someone who feels really touched out and can't stand it and their kid is climbing all over them, I'm not trying. I hear that. I know that happens. And not like you have to be sort of perfect mana every moment, but I think understanding that the way that humans generate growth hormone, one of the most important ways is through skin-to-skin contact, is really important. So when you have your second baby, hopefully your husband too will take off his shirt and just be skin-to-skin with the baby, and as much naked time as possible is really, it's wonderful. It is, because it floods your body with oxytocin and love hormones. You can feel it. We did something with our fourth that is so out there. I'm a little bit afraid to tell you about it, but because you've read my books. But we did infant pottying, is the way that I like to call it. Where you basically, and what that is, it is really out there. It was so out there, Nikki, that like I had been exposed to that with my oldest, and I just I wasn't open-minded enough to even ask questions about it. It just seemed so crazy to me. And that's more of a testament to who I was 22 years ago when I was pregnant with her, right, than to anything about it. But the truth is, it is in a lot of traditional cultures, babies don't wear diapers, and they're not peeing and pooping all over their parents. What is happening is that their parents are really reading the baby's cues, and those can be mostly physical cues, and also verbal cues. So the same way that you, as a mom, you can tell the difference between your baby's cry when she needs to breastfeed and she's hungry. My little one used to go, That was her way of saying, Mom, feed me. Or that, she's tired and you realize that she needs to sleep, or, she feels cold. Like you kind of, as a new mom, learn all of those cues. You learn to see what the baby needs and respond to it, right? And you can do that also with the baby's need to urinate and defecate, because humans actually have an instinct not to soil the nest, just like every mammal. It's kind of fascinating. But in any case, and you just learn to recognize the cues of when the baby needs to go to the potty, and then you communicate with them about that. So like when the baby pees, you make a noise for that. And when the baby poops, you make another noise. And then what ends up happening is that you just basically are talking to each other. And so you end up needing to almost never change a diaper, it's kind of a beautiful thing. But in any case, the reason why I was bringing that up is because I had never had the experience of holding just a naked baby, a completely naked baby, because for 3 kids, we used cloth diapers, but we used diapers on all the kids. And I never thought, I wish that someone had told me, Nikki, not necessarily about infant potting, but I wish that they had said, hey, you know that you always know when your baby needs to poop, because it was totally clear from day one when this kid needed to poop. It was just completely obvious. And I wish somebody had just said, listen, when you know she needs to poop, take the diaper off and either hold her over the toilet or hold her over a little potty or hold her over a little $1 bowl you can buy at the Dollar Tree. And then you won't have to change the diaper. And then you can just wash her up, with a little bit of warm water. And
I'm going to try it.
yes. I mean, you'll try it, but beware, because it's kind of addictive and it's so much easier. That's the thing is, like, in our culture, there was some articles about this in the New York Times years ago, and they were all about these type A moms who were, wanted their kids to be potty trained early. That's not at all what this is about. Yeah. It has nothing to do with that. It just has to do with actually holding your baby close and paying attention to their needs. And I bring all of that up just to get back to the earlier question, which is, that early affection and the skin to skin contact and the holding a naked baby in your arms and is so important for lifelong good health, both mental and physical. And in our culture, your doctor is going to tell you, don't sleep with your baby. Don't answer your baby. Don't pick your baby up when she cries. Don't be so responsive. Don't smile. It's like, no doctor will say don't smile at your baby, but they will say, oh, if she's crying, just ignore her. And that's actually the idea behind that in American culture is that you want your child to grow up to be independent and resilient. And the truth is the opposite. The truth is that babies who have very secure attachments as children, as infants and young children, so they know that if they hurt themselves, their mom's not going to ignore them or shame them or tell them to man up and stop crying because boys don't cry. But their mom is going to be a soft place to land, and their dad, of course, or any other adults in their lives. They're, they know that, and their feelings are going to be taken seriously and not ridiculed. Those babies with secure attachments are much less likely to grow up to have drug problems or alcohol problems or, any kind of addiction problems. And I'm not saying it's a guarantee, Nikki, but it's something that really tips the scale in favor of much better lifelong good health. And the other thing that I wanted to say about addiction is that, so I come from a family that also struggled a lot with addiction, and I have 3 older brothers. My grandfather was a pretty high functioning alcoholic. We have addiction on both sides of our family. My husband's mom was a non-functioning alcoholic who really had a hard time and is thankfully sober now. And it's something that we have always talked to our kids about. And, time will tell, because so far so good. My fingers are crossed. You're can't hear me, but they see me. But open and honest communication with a lot of heart and with emotion, I think, is really important. So some people think, don't talk about it. Don't talk about sex. Don't talk about violence. Don't talk about, pornography. Don't talk about drugs. Don't talk about alcohol. They think that if you talk about these things, it's going to make your kid want to do them, or, it's going to bias them. And the opposite is true. We know that the families that are open about talking about, mutually consensual lovemaking and issues surrounding sex with their kids, not when your child is 2.5, ever. But I'm not saying not ever. Of course, you can tell him all of his anatomy parts, and you always answer. My mother always said, an honest question deserves an honest answer. That's always true at no matter what age, if your child is 1, 11, or 21. But at the time when it comes up and children start to become interested in asking questions, you don't say, oh, we'll talk about that later, or, oh, that's not appropriate, or, oh, don't ask about that. But you talk about it. So you talk about your husband's cousin and his struggles, and you talk about how sad it makes you feel because he's suffering so much. And you say, And then you ask your child questions, when they get to be around 13 or 14, which is when a lot of these issues start coming up. And I mean, some children in America become sexually active at age 12,
Gosh.
You've got to have open communication with your kids, and you've got to be honest about your fear. And you can even say, we've had so many struggles in our family with addiction, and I worry because I don't want you to make choices that could lead you down the wrong path.
Did you see, like, in your research, just in terms of how much the parents drank? Like, I'm sure obviously, like, alcoholism, definitely it can, like, parents being alcoholics can just be passed down because that's what the kids are like seeing and what they're accustomed to. And then the parents obviously aren't, like, that's their coping mechanism. So that's what they're teaching. But I mean, in terms of like, just, a healthy amount of the alcohol is just such a big part of our society. I don't like it personally. I'm not a big fan, but I mean, obviously then, the other thing is, like you said, you don't just want to like not have it and not talk about it and not teach how to use it.
Yeah.
Appropriately, right?
That's a really fascinating question. And I like to look at other cultures. There's an excellent book called Parenting Without Borders that was written by someone named Christine Groslow, who's a friend and colleague of mine. And she went to so many different countries to she's Korean American and her husband is Jewish American, and they raised their children partly in the United States and partly in Japan. And then he visited places like Finland and France and Germany, and kind of to look at, the book focuses on more on education, but it's sort of a lot. It's a wonderful, fascinating book. But, so one thing I like to do is kind of look at how other cultures do things and see, taking the best, from each of the other cultures. And something that's fascinating is that in places where children, this is another sort of very counterintuitive, but in places like France, where children are welcome to partake, like they sit and have meals together, and young kids that are probably younger than we would feel comfortable with will be offered, watered down wine. And they do that in Italy too. It looks like in places where alcohol isn't this sort of forbidden taboo, or isn't something that you don't have access to, it looks like that those cultures actually have better outcomes in terms of numbers of alcoholics. So this has been this ongoing question in our family, and something, I'm fascinated by the research, but also we have an N equals 6, right? There's 6 of us. But I always, when I was younger, my father would let us try he likes to drink blended scotch. And, I remember the feeling of how it tasted and it kind of burning in my throat, and, and was very open. My dad was very open about talking about alcohol. And with my own kids, and my husband's mom really can't drink at all. She can't have a sip of alcohol. She's in recovery from alcoholism, but she really is somebody who her whole personality changes when she starts to drink. But my husband does drink a little bit, not every day. But he and I both drink, and we kind of took the attitude, like, we never locked away the alcohol. We would let the kids try our drinks, but we talked about it. We talked about sort of appropriate use of alcohol, and, and whether or not that was the best approach, you've got to have me back on your show in 10 years.
Yeah.
We can see how we did. And I always had that as a question. And it's actually a question that I've talked to my kids about, like, do you think it's better to be, shut off from that? But I also know in college, I went to Cornell University, and my roommate in college had been a missionary kid, and Dominica, she wasn't allowed to talk on the phone with boys, and she had never had a drink in her life. And she got to college and she really went crazy and became, totally out of control with sex, drugs, and alcohol. And the same thing, interestingly, happened to Dr. Thomas. Paul Thomas grew up in Africa. He was in Rhodesia. It's now called Zimbabwe. And he had almost no exposure to alcohol at all. And when he did have exposure to it, he loved it so much. He was like, oh my God, this is me. I've come home. And it looks like he had a genetic predisposition to become an alcoholic. The question is, would he have become, he was a missionary kid also, would he have become an alcoholic earlier or less functional? Because he was a very high functioning, his whole struggle with alcohol, he was very high functioning. Would he have become an alcoholic earlier or been less high functioning if he had had more access to it, if he had been in a culture where he had access to it? Or would he have been able to not become an alcoholic and be able to drink in kind of what we would consider a healthy way? Those are questions that are very hard to answer.
Yeah. And I think it kind of segues a little bit into like currently with everything going on, because on one hand, like for me, I'm like, oh my gosh, I need to move. I need to buy acres of land. I just want to move away. I don't want to be near 5G. I don't want to be near any of these schools where drugs are a situation. I don't want to be near anyone telling my family what we can and can't do in terms of our medical health, including vaccinations. I don't want, and I'm like, oh, I'm just going to like live off my own land, like be in my own world, create my own community. And it's funny because on one hand, like I definitely think, in terms of freedom, like, our freedoms are being infringed upon, and it is nice to have something like that as an idea and to prepare maybe. But then on the other hand, I keep thinking, but what about just being part of society and in general? Because I'm Persian, so like I understand the importance of culture and being around others and connecting and not feeling like a total outcast, even though I don't want to say outcast because I think just like what's normal now is just so wild. But yeah, I know it's just like, so I don't want to be part of that anyways. But then I'm like, I think of my children and it's, you don't want to just totally shield them from everything. It's not like I'm going to create a cult. And so I just think about those things all the time. And I think that kind of segues into just what's happening right now and how these, unfortunately, just our personal medical choices are, creating so much tension for people. And especially on the West Coast, I would say, like the states we live in, California, Oregon, Washington, and New York, those are, I think, probably some of the worst states in terms of medical freedom and not having that. And I really noticed that so much more once I had my son. And I think what happens is people aren't as aware of it because it's really being done to our children for the most part. But then this whole COVID situation actually made it so that it's become such a bigger conversation because there are but it's also so political. And it's interesting because we both live in a liberal state but then I would say both of our views are very progressive, but it's considered such a, such a right-wing mentality. So
I want to go back to something that you said earlier in this conversation about how we're being told that we have to, we have to do X, Y, or Z to, quote, protect other people. And there's a huge misconception that people who have evidence-based, scientifically grounded concerns about vaccine safety don't care about other people. In my experience, it's actually the opposite. It's people who are making judicious choices about vaccines, which includes the choice not to vaccinate, are actually the people who are thinking the most about the community and the society in general. It's not people who are, super selfish and don't care about other people's health. It's not people who aren't wearing seatbelts. It's actually people who have taken the time to look into what the recommendations are. And people who are just following along don't have a reason for following along. They just have appeal to authority. So they basically are saying, well, we trust the CDC and we trust the FDA and we trust the government, and you should too. And I don't know about you, but I've been trying very hard to raise my children to be critical, thoughtful thinkers, to make their own decisions, to trust their intuition and to use their their brains, which means to use the prefrontal cortex, not the amygdala, of the brain to make smart choices. And sometimes those choices will dovetail with what the mainstream narrative is, but very often you're going to be at odds with the government position. And why is that? Because our government is being so largely funded. These agencies are being funded by the pharmaceutical industry, and we have a for-profit medical system, which means that if your child's not sick, people lose literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars every single year. So if you don't have a reason to take your child to the doctor because your child is so incredibly healthy, think of all of the big networks that are going to go out of business. Not only is your doctor going to lose money on a personal level, but the insurance companies are actually going to end up losing money. The big pharmaceutical companies are going to lose money. The formula industry is going to lose money. Like, you doing what is optimal for your child's health and your family's health is actually tremendously threatening. So threatening that we try to shut it down and we try to discredit it and we try to say, oh, those people are just, completely insane and they're dangerous and they're putting other people at risk. Well, I don't know on what planet a healthy, thriving young person who isn't sick and who is in perfect health is a danger to anybody else. That's not reality. That is a fantasy spun by the pharmaceutical industry's unbelievably sophisticated PR.
I completely agree with you. And my question for you is, do you think, because like you mentioned, our entire system is wrapped up in this, it's so different than the tobacco industry? I don't know. I haven't researched, but I mean, I'm sure obviously they paid so much to the media and whatnot, but I feel like this is just so ingrained in our culture, and it's a part of every aspect of what we do. I mean, it's part of even the rest of the world, like, they can't believe we get commercials for pharmaceuticals, right? It's just part of everything. And so I'm curious, is it possible for this system to change the more people wake up, the more people are aware of, healthy practices that are part of preventative care and stuff? Do you think that it's possible to change at all without like crashing our entire economy? Probably, it's just like,
Nikki, I do. I really do. And I am relentlessly optimistic. And years ago, somebody accused me of being naive. And I said, I hope the older I get, the more naive I'll be, because, you just need to live a few more years and then you'll become jaded like me, was the sentiment at the time. And I think that we have to be relentlessly optimistic, and we have to know that the most important thing is to have a better future for our children. And we do have common goals. I mean, despite the ridiculous pressure from for-profit business, everybody theoretically wants to be happy and healthy. They don't want to just survive. They want to thrive. They want to be able to be active and participating, right, in life and in culture and everything else. So, I do believe that we can change the system. And I think we're in a very difficult moment in our nation's history and our planet's history. I mean, this is akin to, you could say the 1918 flu pandemic, or you could say it's akin to times when culture really, that's what people are saying, is that, we're in this global pandemic. I would say we're in something much more, or as you can tell I'm trying to pick my words carefully.
Yeah.
We're in a very pernicious and difficult moment. And when things were going wrong in human culture on a global scale, let's talk about the Holocaust, because, and I know it's very unpopular to make these kind of comparisons, but I'm Jewish. Both of my parents are Jewish. And I grew up with an understanding of the millions of people who were sent to the gas chambers during the Holocaust. And I always ask the question, how could people have done that? How could good people act so badly? And I think that it's not an unfair comparison to talk about how good people are acting in this moment. And it's true that we're not putting people on trains to concentration camps. So I don't want to be making an unfair parallel, but we have been damaging the brains and the immune systems of literally millions of American children. And unfortunately, now that we have this idea that the only way to get ourselves out of COVID is through vaccination, which is a completely wrong idea, we are seeing now an untold amount of damage from the vaccine. So what I've heard from the doctors that I've interviewed, these are medical doctors who are in the system, who are pro-vaccine. And I've talked to an emergency room doctor who's in Arizona and a family practitioner who has a huge practice with thousands of patients, who are very mainstream among many other doctors who I've spoken to personally. What I've heard them say is that, for all intents and purposes in the United States, COVID itself is over. And now what they're seeing, the fallout that they're seeing, is from responses to the vaccine and emergency room visits, people dying from things like anaphylactic shock and myocarditis, which is swelling of the heart muscle. We have now definitive information from Israel that, yes, you have a much higher chance of getting myocarditis in men ages 16 to 30 following vaccination. And then, I got a text yesterday from a ER nurse in Southern California, where you are, and she said, in her entire history, she's worked for more than 10 years as an emergency room nurse. She's never seen a child or a teenager come in with myocarditis. And she said that they've been inundated with children, young, 12-year-olds, 13, 14, coming in with myocarditis, and the doctors have never seen this before. And it's all post-vaccination, and none of it is actually being reported. It's so hard to report right now. The VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System, which maybe you've talked about on this podcast before, it's down all the time. They're having so many submissions from all over the United States that doctors can't get into it. And then once you get into it, the system is slow, so slow that you're tempted to even abandon the report. And that's just people wanting to do the VAERS reports. People at these big hospitals, pediatric hospitals that are seeing this stuff are saying, oh, no, we're not going to report that right now. We're going to do something differently. So there's actually willful ignoring of what's going on, and then the inability to report. And even given all of that, Nikki, the number of deaths that we have seen temporally related to the vaccine. So one of them is my friend's 32-year-old son, who 7 hours after he got the vaccine, he had a heart attack, went to the hospital, and didn't come back. He died. And so, we're seeing, even given all of the problems, the underreporting, the sluggishness, the crashing of VAERS, we've seen more than 5,000 deaths directly following vaccination. And tragically, many of those deaths have been in people who are inappropriate age, meaning 15-year-old. There's been reports that my friend's 32-year-old son that was reported to VAERS, 25-year-olds. And the thing about this, Nikki, is that with COVID, we think there was excess death. I mean, the CDC still has to be tabulating information about this and getting data. Whether the data will be accurate or not is another conversation. But how much excess death did we see, and in what age categories? In the United States, the average life expectancy is something like 78 years old, right? It fluctuates from year to year. It's around 78. And so when you see deaths with COVID of people 78 or older, those are appropriate deaths. That's what should be having happen in our culture, right? At some point, every one of us, the human death rate has stayed steady on the planet at 100%. That hasn't changed, right?
Yeah.
So this idea, so someone who dies with COVID who's over 78, we can assume has lived an appropriate lifespan and a long, hopefully healthy life. When we start seeing deaths being skewed into 15-year-olds, 32-year-olds, then something is really, really wrong. A culture, a population where young people are dying before they can have children is not a culture that can be sustained.
Which is then another, conversation about, is that what is happening in terms of what is wanted, right?
Right. I mean, I don't know if people listening are on board with this or if they feel deep cognitive dissonance and they're basically rolling their eyes. But one thing you have to think about is that the number, whether you think, okay, well, VAERS is a passive reporting system, not all of those deaths are going to be accurate. They're not entirely vetted, which is true, although the CDC and the FDA, they actually go back and they will look at every single one. Right now, they're completely inundated. They said it's going to take months. They said they can't even investigate these reports because they're backlogged by many months. But what I can tell you, Nikki, is that we have seen more deaths reported to VAERS in the beginning of 2021 than in the last 20 years of reporting for every single other vaccine given in the United States.
And so then how is it that they're approving Pfizer for 6-month-olds? I mean, it just got emergency use approval.
It's absolutely criminal. And what gives me hope, which goes back to your earlier question, is that we have literally thousands of doctors now, the most highly credentialed establishment doctors who are speaking out against this travesty. And one of them that I would love for your listeners to know about is Peter Mccullough, who is a very prominent cardiologist and kidney specialist who also does epidemiology, and he's at Texas A&M, and he is so articulate and so smart and has been keeping up with absolutely all of the peer-reviewed scientific literature. And, you know, he has a team of like 160 medical doctors who are all talking about this. And unfortunately, or what feels ironically perhaps to you and me, is that the outlets that are giving them voice are all right-leaning. So you can look Peter Mccullough up on Fox News. He's been on Laura Ingraham. He's been on lots and lots of podcasts. His testimony to the Senate in Texas, the Senate Health Committee, has gone viral. He's absolutely spectacular, but you won't find him on YouTube, and because big tech is censoring alternative voices. But what Dr. Mccullough says is that there absolutely is effective early treatment that will work, that if you have a COVID diagnosis, it is not a death sentence, that it's an absolute crisis in medicine, that we haven't pursued these early interventions that work, and that the reason why is because when scientists or when big pharma realized that this virus may be amenable to a vaccine, they did everything they could to suppress any information about early and effective treatments, to the point where the FDA just took N-acetylcysteine off of over-the-counter use. And
exactly, I was going to get into that with you too, because not only is it so I can't believe it. I love N-acetylcysteine so much, and it's a precursor to glutathione, and now they're wanting to take off. Have you seen the list that they're reviewing?
Yes.
Like colloidal silver, glutathione, even things such as curcuminoids. I mean, it's so many things that we use as a family all the time. Yes, we eat well, we do so many things, we stay healthy that way, but supplements are so important, and they just want to review the supplements to make it less likely to have access to them. And they say that now you have to go to a doctor to get them. And my fear is that then they're going to start, then they're going to be able to see, which doctors are prescribing it. And, it'll become this whole thing.
The idea that you would have to go to a doctor to get something like, vitamin C or N-acetylcysteine is absolutely ludicrous and ridiculous. And, that we should force people into a medical system that isn't working is wrong. And how can I say that? Well, look at our outcomes. If the FDA and the CDC and the government were really caring mostly about Americans' health, then we would have the best health outcomes. We're a powerful, wonderful, incredible country. I love America. I really do. And we have cutting edge technology. We have the best universities on the planet. We do really good scientific research that ironically is then translated and used in other countries to change practices, but we keep doing things the same way here. If we really cared about our nation's health, we wouldn't have the highest maternal mortality rate of any country in the industrialized world, which we're up there in the top highest maternal mortality. We wouldn't have an ignominiously high infant mortality rate of children within the first few days of life, we wouldn't have these skyrocketing rates of diabetes, cancer, immune disorders, chronic disease. And the fact that we have those, and so many Americans are obese, and so many Americans are struggling with terrible chronic illnesses in addition to life-threatening diseases, and that we talked earlier about our, life expectancy. It's actually not very good. If you look internationally, our life expectancy is much, much lower than it should be based on other industrialized countries. The fact that we have such bad health outcomes and that we are so profit driven, meaning that we are spending so much more money on health than any other country in the industrialized world. In fact, than like 13 countries combined.
Wow.
Should really give any thinking person pause. And it should really, I'm not saying, disagree just to disagree. I'm saying that you absolutely have to do your own research. The same way you're probably not going to buy a car seat for your child without really looking into the consumer reports and comparing and doing some contrasting before you choose the best seat. You're going to talk to your friends. You're going to read some reviews. You're going to ask the shopkeeper, you're really going to look into it. The same way that we would do that with anything. The same with your child's education. You're going to look at the schools and decide if your child's going to go to school or be homeschooled, but you're going to go and you're going to meet with the teachers and the principal. We absolutely have to be doing that with our health as well.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree with you. And I think that what you shared is so important. I want everyone to kind of go back and listen to that multiple times. We spend more money on health compared to 13 other industrialized countries combined. Is that what you just said?
Yes.
And then yet we then give the pharmaceutical industry the power to do all these things when we have some of the worst health outcomes. So I think that is in and of itself so empowering to know, because then when you do your own research, when you read books like Your Baby, Your Way, when you're pregnant or before you're pregnant, when you're planning on becoming a mother, and other books that you've co-authored or any other information out there, I think the most important message is empower yourself. Your doctor isn't the end all be all. You know your body better than anyone else does. And look into it, get second opinions and talk about it. And I think also going back to the conversation we kind of had earlier with, you kind of bringing up Germany and concentration camps and kind of comparing in that sense. Another comparison I have to that is, those people who were saving the Jews, people who were saving people from slavery. I've been watching this show, Underground Railroad, recently that just came out on Amazon. So I've been thinking a lot about that and the civil rights movement. Those people risked their lives. It was life or death in order to stand up and say something and say that it's wrong. And for you and I to stand up, it's still very scary, especially we have children. Yours are at least older. There's so much that can happen. But at the end of the day, it's nothing compared to the risks that those others, the social justice warriors, took before us. And I really believe when it comes to medical freedom, when it comes to advocating, and when it comes to sharing this information, like people who know about it and understand and are scared to share their opinions, I just really want to encourage everyone, if you feel that you know something or you've done the research and you're uncomfortable sharing because you don't want to make other people uncomfortable with their decisions, I really think thinking back on how you can change the perspective of, oh, only Republicans or only right-wing people don't believe in the vaccine, or only, that it's us speaking up that's going to change the narrative around what the media has created. Right. And it's people like you that are really a huge game changer in this. So I really want to acknowledge you and acknowledge your work. And I appreciate you so much. And everyone, read all of Jennifer's books. They're amazing. I love them. And I can't wait to get it's called Addiction Spectrum, or...
Yeah, it's called the Addiction Spectrum.
Yeah. I can't wait to read that one. It's something I've been meaning to do, but just your perspective on everything. I really appreciate it. I appreciate your voice, and I'm so honored to have had you join us today. Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Thanks for having me, Nikki. And if people want to find out more about me or sign up for my weekly email, which I send once a week, they can find me at www.jennifermargulis.net.
I love your website so much. The content on there is so good, and I read it. We syndicate some of it sometimes, and I love just like staying up at night and going through what you've written. So I can attest to that. Go on her website. It's so good, and definitely get Your Baby Your Way. It's my number one book.